Just to get you in the mood, let's start with a few little dilemmas. So, your country's under attack and you're preparing to defend it. Just then your mother calls and tells you she's seriously ill and needs your help. Do you go and take care of your mother, or do you abandon her to fight for your country? You're a member of a sports team. I won't be collecting answers to this, so you can just keep them to yourself. You're a member of a sports team that always loses to a rival team. You have an opportunity to join that rival team. Do you take it? You borrow £10 from a friend, and the friend completely forgets about it. Do you give him the £10 back? You and a different friend, you've got more than one friend, are walking along a street when you notice a £20 note on the ground and you bend down to pick it up. Do you offer to share this £20 note, this £20 with your friend? So hopefully, or in most people, those situations evoke a range of thoughts and feelings, intuitions, ideas and concepts about what to do, what would be the right thing to do, what would be the moral thing to do. And the question for anyone interested in this area is, what are these thoughts and feelings? Where do they come from? How do they work? What are they for? And what, if anything, do they have in common? So these kinds of questions, philosophers and others have struggled with them for millennia, and it's still the case that some people are so, not necessarily philosophers, some people are so baffled by morality, they think it's so bizarre that it must have a supernatural origin. But I think the good news is that we now have a scientific explanation for morality. Scientific in the sense that we have a theory that uses nothing more than sort of uncontroversial aspects of natural life, behavioural sciences, and scientific in the sense that it makes testable predictions about moral phenomena, predictions that we can test. And essentially, the kind of headline is that this theory is that morality is all about cooperation. Morality is a set of tools for cooperation. So it's a set of ways of solving the recurrent problems of cooperation and conflict that crop up in human social life. These are some of these tools are biological. Humans have been equipped by natural selection with these tools. Others are cultural. They're new ways that we've invented of solving some of these problems. This is a theory I call just morality as cooperation. So let me just step back and give you the world according to this view, the world according to morality as cooperation, how this explains morality. So according to this view, here's a natural history of morality. Let's start with nothing. Empty your minds. That was quick. So according to this theory, life begins when we have molecules that make copies of themselves, when we have replicators. These replicators are selfish in the technical sense that they promote their own replication, but they can do this in a variety of ways. Replicators can promote their replication at the expense of other replicators, or they can do this in concert with other replicators. They can compete with other replicators, or they can cooperate with them. In game theoretic terms, we call this these competitive interactions zero-sum, where one party's gain is the other's loss, so the sum is zero. And we call the cooperative interactions non-zero-sum. Non-zero-sum interactions are win-win, where both parties can benefit. There's the opportunity for mutual gain, mutual benefit. So according to this theory, it has been the case that natural selection has favoured solutions to non-zero-sum problems. It's favoured cooperative strategies in a whole variety of different ways in a whole variety of different species, including in humans, who've been living in groups for 50 million years and have spent the last few million years as intensely collaborative hunter-gatherers. And like I said, in addition to whatever evolution has equipped us with, whatever our biological heritage is, humans also have the ability to invent new ways of doing things, to invent new rules, new tools, new techniques, new cultural ways of solving these problems. So as a result of this biological and cultural heritage, humans are awesome cooperators, super cooperators, cooperate on an unprecedented scale. And it's the argument, this thesis is that it's this collection of biological and cultural mechanisms, it's this collection of intuitions and institutions, these are the things that philosophers and others have called morality. This is what morality is made of, this is what generates the behaviours and actions and dispositions that we call moral. So this isn't a entirely novel idea. I mean, the idea that morality has something to do with cooperation is widespread in the history of moral philosophy. There's been many from Plato and Aristotle onwards. You find many examples of the social contract theorists, for example. You find many examples of philosophers saying, there's cooperation, something about morality that seems to be related to cooperation. Cooperation accommodates a lot of our moral ideas. And it's an idea that's widespread in contemporary approaches to the nature of morality, contemporary empirical approaches. So here's a sample of some prominent psychologists and anthropologists who take it as given, or one of their assumptions is that morality in one way or another is about cooperation, promotes cooperation, supports cooperative relationships, and so on. So it's an idea that's out there, but what these approaches don't do is they don't make full use of the mathematical theory of cooperation, of the game theory, the non-zero-sum game theory, to really nail down their account of cooperation, and importantly take advantage of the fact that game theory identifies different types of cooperation. There's not just one big problem, there's a number of different types of problem. And so taking the game theory of cooperation seriously leads you to expect a number of different types of morality. So, the picture speaks 1,000 words. So, from an evolutionary game theory point of view, from an animal behaviour point of view, there's at least 4 main types of cooperation. Kinship, mutualism, exchange, and conflict resolution. They go by a few different names, but these are names I like. So kinship is the idea that a gene in one body can get copies of itself or copies of itself replicated by helping replicas that are present in other bodies and other individuals, i.e. in genetic relatives. Under certain circumstances, natural selection will favour genes that benefit copies of itself even at expense to itself, because the net gain to genes of that type is positive. So evolutionary theory under certain circumstances, expects animals to be equipped with mechanisms that detect and deliver benefits to genetic relatives, and that is indeed the case, with eusociality and parental care being the most obvious examples. Mutualism refers to situations where individuals can do better by working alone than they can do by working by themselves. As usual, Darwin provides a very nice little vignette example of this. He talks about a troop, I think it is, a troop of baboons gathering around a big stone and all working together to lift it up in order to get at the grubs underneath. And he says when they all get together and lift it up, and then they all share the booty, he says. And the point is that by working together, these baboons can lift a bigger rock, presumably with more grubs under it, than any one individual could lift by themselves. There's been relatively little work on the mechanisms that make. And in order to work together like that, organisms have to coordinate their behaviour with others, which is a whole other branch of game theory. There's been relatively little work on the specific adaptations, specific mechanisms for coordination in other creatures, but there's no doubt that many other creatures do indeed succeed in coordinating their behaviour and working together to their mutual benefit, as evident in the ubiquity of shoals and herds and collaborative hunting and coalitions and alliances. Sometimes the benefits of cooperation are kept just out of reach by the problem of free riders. So free riders are sometimes where instead of exchanging benefits at the same time. There's some uncertainty about whether a benefit will be returned, perhaps because the benefit's returned at a later date. And in those situations, it's very difficult to get cooperation off the ground, unless I presume you're familiar with this general idea, unless the cooperators meet repeatedly and they have the opportunity to implement some kind of strategy of conditional cooperation, where they reciprocate what the other party did in the previous round. So I'll cooperate if you cooperate back, and then off we go. But if you stop cooperating, or you take advantage of you take the benefit without paying the cost, or returning the favour, then I cut off cooperation, and maybe I'll punish you, maybe I'll go somewhere else. There's been, as illustrated here by the "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours" idiom. There's surprisingly, people were very excited about reciprocal altruism when Trivers talked about it in an animal behaviour context in the 70s, and people thought, aha, this is going to mop up every other aspect of non-kin cooperation. And there's been surprisingly little evidence of it, of true full-blown reciprocity present in other organisms. There's certainly some bits of it present in some organisms, and then there might indeed be full-blown versions present in some primates, and certainly people like Frans de Waal would maintain there are. We just haven't designed the right studies to find it. But it seems relatively rare in other species in any case, but something that humans are particularly good at. Another aspect, and in the history of evolution of cooperation, the work on the evolution of cooperation, kinship and exchange or reciprocity have got the lion's share of the attention, and people have tended to overlook mutualism and also conflict resolution, as I'll explain. Even though conflict resolution was the first non-zero-sum problem to get the game theory treatment by Maynard Smith in the early 70s. So conflict resolution refers to situations where it's often the case that organisms are in competition for territory, for food, for mates, and so in that sense it looks like a zero-sum game. It looks like a straight fight between two or more individuals. However, there's better and worse ways of conducting that fight, and individuals have the opportunity to. Any fight involves cost to both parties in terms of time and energy and injury, and so both parties to these conflicts have a mutual interest in trying to minimise the cost of conflict, trying to reduce the mutual cost. And there's a variety of ways of doing that. So, for example, Will and I might be in conflict over this bottle of water. We might be squaring up to have a fight over it. We're in conflict, and we could just have a fight, and whoever has the biggest muscles wins. And hypothetically, let's say that's you, Will. But instead of having a fight, we might just agree. We're essentially now we're just going to flex our muscles at each other and agree to whoever has the biggest muscles wins the prize. If we do that, then it's still the case that the strongest person wins. The outcome is the same, but we both avoided the cost of natural conflict. We both avoided a black eye. And so that leads us to expect that natural selection will favour a kind of display and defer strategy. And indeed that is the case. There's tons of lovely work on how animals engage in ritual contests where they display essentially costly signals, reliable signals of their fighting ability. Sometimes that's muscles, sometimes more. Sometimes it's stature or height or size of antlers or the volume of your bellow. Sometimes how much you stink, how much the strength of your must. Or if you're a spider, it can be two spiders competing on a web, as whoever can bounce the hardest wins the fight. And there's a whole range of nice ways of doing it. Another way we could resolve the conflict is if it's a divisible resource, as this is. Instead of fighting in an all or nothing way, we can agree to divide it. We can share it. And the game theory says that a stable way of doing that is to share the resource in proportion to our relative fighting ability. That's a stable way of doing it. So that means that if equal shares for equals, basically. And those are called bargaining problems, and so another whole branch of game theory. Third way there's more to conflict resolution than you thought. Another way of solving problems of resolving conflicts is to defer to prior ownership. And again, this is another widespread strategy. The game theory will show that this strategy will work, and there's plenty of examples of organisms following this particular strategy. So there's a whole variety of different problems of cooperation, and there's a variety of different solutions. I've just kind of given you the headline solution in each case, but there's, take my word for it, there's a whole sort of headline tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to this iceberg underneath. Lots of rich, fantastic work on different types of cooperation and different solutions. And here's a scary summary of some of it. So, and the general argument is that we have these variety of different theories of how cooperation can get off the ground. It's no mystery. We have more or less good examples of different non-human animals and occasionally some plants where natural selection has favoured these cooperative strategies to produce social and cooperative and sometimes altruistic animals, organisms. And this theory and this kind of, as it were, precedent has motivated research in humans. So, well, given that humans are social primates, lived in groups for millions of years, they live in families, they work in teams, they engage in trade, they have conflicts over resources. Given this background, it's reasonable to expect humans to exhibit some of the same behaviour. And I'm not going to get into whether it's biological or cultural. We don't have to get into that. The point is the same. That there's good reason for thinking, and plenty of evidence to think that humans have a range of evolved mechanisms for solving specific types of cooperation. And in addition, humans have built on these biological foundations, or have culture has grown up this biological trellis, and we've elaborated on these different types of cooperation, and in some cases invented new ways of doing it. For example, I just saw an example recently. Queuing, forming a queue to allocate a resource, is a way of resolving a conflict over a resource. I don't think it's the case that it's not necessarily a case that there's an evolved mechanism. We have a module for queuing, who knows, it might be, but nevertheless, here's a cultural rule that solves this problem of cooperation in a way of that perhaps makes use of some intuitions about first come, first served, or whoever gets there first has precedence. Who knows? So we have a whole range of more or less trivial and very serious cultural ways of solving these problems too. And like I said, the argument is that these mechanisms, these strategies, whatever it is they're made of, these are the things that philosophers and others have called moral. These are the mechanisms that generate the behaviour that we regard as moral. And if you follow, so what we have here is a kind of a periodic table of ethics, and if you follow the logic through from the theory to the animal examples to human behaviour to the philosophy, you see that it's these kinds of things that are remarked upon by philosophers and anthropologists and psychologists and others as this is the stuff of morality. So kinship gives rise to the feeling that we have special obligations to kin, especially to our kids, and things like aversion to incest. Mutualism and teamwork mutualism give rise to friendship, to conformity, to following conventions, following group norms, to feelings that your loyalty to your in-group, for example. Exchange give rise to phenomena like trust and trustworthiness and reciprocity, punishment, gratitude, guilt, and so on. The twin branches of the displayed first strategy give rise to what I've called hawkish traits and dovish traits. So hawkish traits are those impressive, admirable displays of strength and courage and fortitude and magnanimity that philosophers have called virtue, coming from the Latin as befits a man. And the flip side of that strategy is to know when you're beaten, to be humble, to submit, to admit defeat, and to defer and respect more powerful individuals, especially as represented in a dominant hierarchy. Strategies of dividing give rise to things like, obviously give rise to fairness, sharing, to other sort of peacekeeping strategies like compromise, negotiation, meeting in the middle, finding common ground, split the difference, agree to disagree, that kind of idea. This strategy gives rise to respect for property and prohibition of theft. So the point is that it's no mystery why humans might have all these things, and in a sense it's no mystery why we might think they're really important and really valuable. For a social species like us, cooperating, getting along, is extraordinarily powerful survival strategy. Cooperation is, other people are our life support mechanism. Cooperation is enormously powerful, and the absence of cooperation, when cooperation breaks down, is extremely costly. So the main point, if you take nothing else away, is that by using nothing more than sort of uncontroversial, well-understood aspects of behavioural sciences, game theory, animal behaviour, evolutionary psychology, behavioural ecology, and other aspects of the behavioural sciences, we have a deep, rich theory of lots of different, comprehensive theory of lots of different aspects of morality, lots of different moral phenomena. And this is a theory that's, like I said, it's scientific in the sense that it makes predictions. If this theory is true, it makes predictions about how we expect morality to work, what we expect it to be, what we expect it to do. So, for example, if this theory is true, if it is the case that all the things we regard as moral are ultimately about cooperation, there's a number of things we would expect in the world. It should be the case that cooperative behaviour is regarded as morally good. And we can be more specific. We can say these specific types of cooperative behaviour, if this theory is true, these are the things that people will regard as moral. Helping a family, being loyal to your group, reciprocating favours, etc. Similarly, it should be the case that failing to do these things, or behaviour that's corrosive to these types of cooperation, neglecting your family, betraying your group, cheating, being cowardly, rebelling against authority, these are the things that people will regard as morally bad. And also we would expect that this should be the case, not just in one particular culture. This is not a theory of this is how Westerners think, or this is how particular schools of philosophy think. The claim that if this theory is true, it should be the case that if these kinds of behaviours are considered moral, not just in one particular culture, but the world over. These should be the basis of some universal moral values. And we can go, I don't want to go into too much additional detail about this, but we can still go a little bit further. The theory says that yes, we should expect these aspects of morality to be universal, but we also can make some predictions about how and why they would vary. If this was a different talk, I'd go on to talk about, it seems to be the case that these values, these behaviours are good candidates for universality, but we also see some variation, and the variation tends to be in the priority attached to these different types of cooperation. Why is that? Well, the theory would say, well, individuals or societies that face different problems, or for whom different problems loom large, would expect these moral values to loom larger too, and to take a more prominent role in local value systems. So in societies where you live in big family groups, special obligations to kin are paramount and very important. In societies where families are dispersed and broken up and you don't interact with kin very much, not surprisingly, the importance attached to your family obligations is accordingly less important, doesn't take priority. So if this was an empirical talk, I'd go on to talk about some projects I'm involved in that are developing these and other predictions and putting them to the test. But instead I'm going to do something slightly different, given this is a more theory philosophical talk, and just talk about some straightforward, obvious objections, counterexamples to this, the approach that I've outlined, the morality as cooperation. So here's a summary of what I've said so far. And I suspect that some of you might be thinking, okay, Oliver, fair enough. We agree that, yes, there are moral values having to do these. This certainly, your theory, or this theory, certainly seems to capture a lot of what morality is about. I concede that it has to do with family values and reciprocity and bravery and things like that. Okay, fair enough. However, there's more to morality. There's two obvious objections people can make, and no doubt people will make. Well, the theory says that all of morality is in here, and it says that there's nothing in here in this segment and nothing in this segment. And obviously, if there were things that cropped up in either of these segments, if there are aspects of morality that didn't have anything to do with cooperation, or if there are instances of cooperation that didn't have anything to do with morality, then that would be a problem for the theory. Those would be counterexamples that would undermine, falsify, require the revision of the theory. And it certainly seems like there are some potential counterexamples. So, for example, there seems like there's certainly seems like some apparent examples of instances of morality that are not about cooperation. And these include things like duties to oneself, duties to preserve your life, to not commit suicide, to not be idle, to take care of yourself, and as Kant argued that duties to yourself are of primary importance and should have a pride of place. So that seems, if Kant said it, it must be true. So this is some serious data that we have to try and grapple with. There's also people also argue that there's duties to people that don't exist, people that you can't cooperate with. Duties to previous generations, duties to the dead, duties to future generations, perhaps to look after the planet for our offspring and for humanity as a whole. People have argued that we have duties to other sentient creatures, also who are not capable of cooperating, whether that's to the children, to the disabled, or to distant strangers, people we never interact with in any real way. And obviously people have argued that we have some moral duties to animals, and maybe even, bless the Swiss, even moral duties to plants. People argue we have duties to the environment, not just for these kind of reasons, but as an entity in itself. And there's a whole load of other moral phenomena that I haven't talked about that are not, as it were, that have yet to be incorporated in this theory, are outstanding puzzles and problems that would be good to tackle. Things like sexual morality, and there's a whole cornucopia of topics there. Things like political morality, of justice and corruption and equality, the ethics of war. Religious morality, all the things under that heading, and a whole bunch of other things: temperance, wisdom, veracity, and so on. So it certainly seems there's a whole bunch of things that are yet to be incorporated by this theory. And certainly, my point here isn't to try and explain every single one of those. But what I do want to do is say that these examples might not be fatal to the project. They might actually be interesting data these are all moral phenomena that any theory should be able to explain. And I just want to point out that the theory has some resources that might be able to explain. There's a few responses available which I think are which save me from despair, that I think have potential. So it might be the case that on closer inspection some of these phenomena do actually turn out to be about cooperation. It certainly seems plausible to me and to others that some of the duties to the self are duties to yourself, to keep yourself together, to develop your talents, to not kill yourself, are moral because they involve making yourself a useful member of society. So the Judge Richard Posner has argued, for example, that we resent idle people not because they're they're a parasite, or because they're taking stuff from other people, they're not necessarily doing that. We resent them because they're not contributing, they're not taking part in cooperative schemes that are of benefit to others. It also seems to me Jonathan Haidt has, one of his moral domains has to do with impurity and things that are disgusting. And I think that's a bit of an anomaly as far as his theory is concerned. He argues that morality is about cooperation, and yet he has a whole domain of purity that is not ostensibly about cooperation, it's about avoiding disgusting things and diseases. I think that you can square that circle by recognising that sometimes disgusting and impure things are a public hazard, they're a public bad. Unclean people are a hazard, impose a cost on other people if they involve spreading disease. So it's not, being dirty is not immoral because it involves disease, it's immoral because it involves a public, it's a social interaction, it involves a public bad. So one reaction, one thing to say is, look, we've got a deep, rich theory. It has lots of explanatory power. Obviously, we need to try and make full use of those explanations to explain these novel, yet to be explained phenomena. Another thing that the theory has up its sleeve is, as it were, spandrels. So for every one of these moral intuitions, for every one of these moral mechanisms, rules, we would expect there to be some byproducts of them. Some example, as Dan Sclover calls it, the proper versus the actual domain. It seems to me that that's the case with animal rights. It's not a controversial theory to say that the reason why we feel well disposed and like we ought to care for animals is because they hit many of the same buttons as do human infants. There's been studies looking at the cuteness. Not surprisingly, we care a lot about. We see people. This is what we're trying to explain. People's moral intuitions. People care a lot about pandas and. I think some other cute things. Puppies and what? Cats and dolphins, yes. Dolphins are a bit weird. But cats and dolphins, they don't care that much about, beetles or slime molds or octopus or wasps, for example. So it's and there's been some nice work looking at basically measuring cuteness and showing that it explains people's attitudes to how they feel about other animals. And not surprisingly, it's another sort of prediction is that women are more, in surveys, women are more in favour of animal rights and taking care of animals than men are, which is consistent with this view. Another possible explanation is what I call hopeful monsters. And I have and what I mean by that is, as I said, so we have, the argument is that we have a range of evolved intuitions about how to solve these problems, but humans can also innovate, they can also invent some new rules, they can try some things out. And there's no guarantee that the novel inventions are all going to succeed. Some of them will succeed and catch on and solve the problem and measure their intuitions. Others will fail, not catch on, for exactly the reason, because they don't mesh with their intuitions, or they don't solve the problem of cooperation. So for example, the philosopher David Benatar, no relation to Pat Benatar, as far as I know, has argued in a very interesting book that humans have a moral imperative not to reproduce. That life is so full of suffering that to bring a child into the world and to experience it is a terrible crime, and so we should refrain from committing this terrible crime. Taking that further, some other philosophers have argued that humanity has an obligation to commit suicide, mass suicide for the sake of the planet, that we're messing up the planet, it's a terrible thing to do, and the right thing to do would be to just everyone take a pill and wipe ourselves off the face of the earth. So here are some things that people have proposed as moral things to do and have written fascinating books and papers about it. But we don't have to, another way of saying is we don't have to take every crazy thing any philosopher has ever said as data that a theory has to explain. On the contrary, the theory of morality as cooperation should be able to predict which ideas catch on and which ones don't. And I humbly submit that these ideas won't catch on as good things for humans to do. The flip side of all this is that not all the other kinds of counterexamples are examples of cooperation that are not moral, and it seems to be that there's many examples of that. There's many examples of mundane cooperation, mundane coordination that don't seem to evoke particularly strong moral intuitions. So, for example, when I'm talking to you, when I'm communicating, I'm solving a coordination problem. I'm aligning your expectations with mine, and I'm according to the theory of cooperation, I'm producing a net benefit. I'm benefiting by talking to you, and you're benefiting by listening. If you weren't, you'd leave, or you wouldn't. Communication only evolves if there's a net benefit to the sender and receiver. So here's a non-zero sum problem, and so that would say that what I'm doing right now is a very altruistic, generous act. I'm doing a very good thing, or writing a book chapter is a tremendous morally good thing. It doesn't feel like that to me. Does it feel like that to you? So there's an example of cooperation as a mutual benefit. It doesn't seem particularly moral. And there's obviously things like the highway code, as with that sign there. That's another a cultural means of promoting coordination, promoting a type of cooperation. People probably think that the highway code is a useful, prudent thing, but not necessarily a moral tone or something to live your life by. It doesn't seem particularly moral. There's also examples of cooperation that are either so they're sort of neutral, as it were. There also seems to be examples of cooperation that are considered positively bad, that are morally bad. So markets are cooperation on a grand scale. Markets are huge networks of reciprocity and exchange, and yet we would recoil from there being a market for organs, for example. That's having a black market for organs. But even being able to sell their organs on eBay, for example, that might be a cooperative. That might involve a cooperative exchange, much to the mutual benefit of the parties involved. But many people would recall in horror as from that kind of cooperation they consider that kind of cooperation to be morally bad. There's also examples of cooperation, for example, among companies, forming cartels and price rigging. So these companies are cooperating to their mutual benefit, and yet we regard that as a bad thing, and we put in place laws to stop it, to break up these cartels, to stop them cooperating. People can cooperate to rob a bank. We wouldn't say that doesn't seem like that cooperation is a good thing, is a morally good thing. And of course, where would they talk about morality be? We have the Nazis. The Nazis were intensely cooperative with each other. I once read a review of a very disconcerting book on Nazi bravery. This was an account of Nazis who won medals. And how did they win medals? They won medals exactly the same as any other soldier, by jumping on grenades, by storming machine gun nests, by acting heroically to save their comrades. They did all the same things, but it was very bizarre. I don't know if you're getting chills thinking about this, but they did exactly the same things as anyone else would do, but they're doing it for the wrong team. It feels weird, and how could they be rewarded? It's weird to think of them as brave, or as the anthropologist John Ladd said, a loyal Nazi is a contradiction in terms. Doesn't compute. So it seems like there's plenty of examples of cooperation that are not moral. However, I'd say that these are not necessarily fatal to the theory. Perhaps on the contrary, they will provide fodder to test it in unusual contexts. So it certainly seems the case that communicating or following the highway code doesn't seem anything particularly moral about that. However, if I fail to cooperate in those ways, if I lie to you, if I communicate, if I say the wrong thing, I don't tell the truth, lying undermines the implicit contract on which communication is based. And there's plenty of so there's a nice literature that takes exactly that approach to try and explain why honesty is good, why veracity is good, why truth telling is good, and why lying and deception is bad. This isn't something that I worked on directly, but when I was beginning to think about these things and try and figure out how these extra moral phenomena might work, I was pleasantly surprised to find this lecture that uses exactly, as it were, exactly what I was predicting, that for some reason in this case, cooperating doesn't seem good, but the failure to cooperate definitely seems bad. Similarly, it doesn't seem particularly good to follow the highway code. How do you feel about someone driving the wrong way down the motorway, turning down the wrong lane and careering down that route? That makes me think of someone being reckless, antisocial, dangerous. That's a problem. They're doing the wrong thing. Another approach to cooperation that doesn't seem to be moral, like the market for organs, markets and organs in particular, is the opposite of the hopeful monsters. So the hopeful monsters are, I always think of the X Factor in this context. So these are moral ideas that are waiting their audition, and the hopeful monsters, they want to be stars, but some of them are monstrously bad at singing and they get kicked out. So these are the opposite. These are monstrous hopefuls. So these are ideas that are waiting their audition, and they look hideous and they look like they're not going to be very good, but they turn out to be very good after all. They're the ones, the other half of the candidates on the X Factor. So these are ideas that look horrible to us now, but we might predict that they look horrible to us because they contradict some deeply held intuition that we had about, in this case, organs, body fluids, sanctity of the body, or something like that. And they strike us at first glance as immoral, disgusting, bad things to do. But perhaps once we get used to the idea, perhaps if it's the case that a market for organs, in fact, would lead to an efficient allocation of organs to the people that need them and recompense the people who are selling them, as has been argued by Janet Radcliffe Richards of this august institution. It might be the case that when people realise that or as people discover that indeed this does solve a problem and this does lead to some net gain for the participants involved, we might change our mind. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time. The history of especially these kinds of biomedical interventions, whether it's blood donation, blood transfusions, test tube babies, and even cremation, all of these proposals were initially regarded with horror and now obviously not controversial at all. And I don't think it's any surprise that the ideas that fall into this category tend to be about evolutionary novel versions of the problem. So I think we have good intuitions for dealing with people, with food, with resources, with objects, with high and low status, men and women, in groups and out groups, so we know how we can get our head around those kinds of problems very easily. But when it comes to interfering with DNA or cloning or removing organs, these are totally evolutionary novel alien things that might take a bit longer for us to understand and evaluate. And in terms of examples of cooperation that seem morally wrong, there's a couple of potential solutions available. One is that I think within the theory of what is good, what people think of as good, is at the same time a theory of what people think is bad. So if the argument is that people think cooperation is good, they'll think lack of cooperation is bad. And there's certainly some cases where, as in the case of the robbers cooperating to rob a bank, there's an example of where, yes, they're cooperating, but they're cooperating in one way to the detriment of some other type of cooperation. We might, on balance, think the net payoff is negative. So, and like I said, if one value is trumping another, that can be one way of trying to understand how moral dilemmas arise and, in practice, are resolved. And with regard to the Nazis or other examples, it seems to me it's exactly the same theory that says the theory is certainly, I think, capable of accommodating this phenomenon. But the theory says that The theory says that cooperative behaviour will be regarded as good. So it can explain why individual Nazis regard what they're doing as good. And it was the case, they regarded what they were doing as good. Because they were cooperating, it was meeting the criteria of cooperating in their group. However, cooperating in one group can be to the detriment to another group. They can be predatory on another group. So we would predict at the same time that that other group is going to think of this as morally bad. And more importantly, if we're third-party observers taking into account not just the interests of one group or another group, but looking at the interests of both groups at the same time, we could argue that engaging in predatory war and starting fights is not an act of cooperation for that group as a whole. It doesn't produce mutual benefits for, say, for Europe as a whole or for humanity as a whole. And so exactly the same theory would lead us to predict that an act that promoted cooperation in one group at the detriment of cooperation of a larger group that we're considering would be considered morally bad. And that's exactly what happened. And it seems to me that's the strength of a theory like this, that it can predict. We're trying to explain where people's moral ideas come from and how they work. And if a theory can explain not just why an individual in one group thinks the way they do, but why individuals taking a different perspective, taking into account a different group of potential cooperators, how they would come to a different perspective, using exactly the same theory, applying exactly the same metrics. So, to wrap up. So what I've argued, essentially what I've argued today is that there's nothing, morality is no mystery, I don't think there's anything bizarre or puzzling or strange about it. There's lots of fascinating wrinkles and things that we need to try and understand, but there's nothing terribly peculiar about it. We have the technology. I've argued that morality is a set of solutions to our social problems, to our problems of cooperation and conflict. And I've argued that if you take that view seriously and you draw on the full range of different theories of cooperation, you end up with a very rich, comprehensive account of an enormous variety of different moral phenomena. And that you end up with a very theory that, as I said, I'm just sort of scratching the surface, a theory that properly developed should be able to make lots of more detailed predictions and testable claims about how morality works in people, whether there's sex differences, age differences, life history differences. It's brilliant with predictions. There's a lot of work to do. I looked at a few headline obvious counterexamples of things that morality doesn't seem to be about cooperation, and cooperation doesn't seem to be about morality. These are potential counterexamples, apparent ones, but I'm hopeful that that they can be incorporated, or these are interesting phenomena that it's a good, challenging problem to try and get to grips with, and I'm confident that it can. And ultimately, the main point is the one I said at the beginning, that it seems to me that this is a theory about what morality is, where it comes from, where it is in the universe, what kind of thing it is. And I've argued that it's this collection of strategies for cooperation. This theory might be true, it might be false, but it seems to me that the way to evaluate whether it's true or false is through doing ordinary science, by drawing out the predictions it makes about the world, about psychology, about people's behaviour, and putting them to the test. I'm not sure where philosophy fits into that, and perhaps I'll be enlightened. But it seems to me that it's only when we start treating morality, moral phenomena, as just the ordinary objects of scientific inquiry that we will really make progress in understanding it. Thank you very much.